of what has been a very long but very interesting day. So thank you everyone for sticking around. I guess I'll close this out here. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about basically some examples from my practice of different kinds of what you might call alternative assessments, specifically contract and specifications grading. So let me just start out here. So first of all, my name is John Graves. I'm an assistant professor of teaching at the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And this is a sort of STEM-focused talk, and I'm mostly teaching sort of the STEM side of economics. I'm going to be particularly talking about my work in a sort of introductory or intermediate statistics context. But I also have tried these things in a number of other areas as well. So just to sort of mention, or to start off, is that a lot of this work was done on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I think it's important because one of the things that we've tried to do, and I've tried to do with alternative assessment, is to try to find ways to make assessment more accessible to people who might be coming from different backgrounds, or who may not have may have different levels of different kinds of mathematical or quantitative skills when they come into university. So we view this as being part of our sort of job to make economics education more accessible to students from all over the place. And that's actually my office there. But, okay, so let me just kind of give you an overview of what I want to talk about. Is basically, as I said, I'm going to talk about two kinds of alternative assessment that I've tried in my classroom. I'll talk about why I chose those particular approaches, how I implemented them, and then whether or not they were successful. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of how success is defined, and sort of the next steps for evaluating this kind of success. So I'm going to start off by talking briefly about the context, to give a little bit of idea of sort of the teaching context for this this experiment that I was trying, and then I'll go through the two examples, and then I'll sort of wrap it up with some conclusions. Okay, so as I said, I teach primarily in the sort of STEM side of economics, and this course particularly it's called Econ 398, but it's an introduction to causal methods. So causal modeling is a sort of interdisciplinary area of statistical economics that teaches students basically how to answer cause and effect style questions, like, does an increase in the minimum wage increase unemployment, but from a statistical or data science perspective. So this course is in the third year. It's sort of pitched towards third-year students. We have a sort of standard four-year program here. And it's an elective for our economics majors, but it's also a required course for certain programs. For example, the combined major in economics and statistics, depending on what they take, they may be sort of required to take this course as a condition of earning their degree. There's one section offered a year, which is mine, and it has about 50 students, although this is varied considerably year over year. And the teaching team basically consists of me and a teaching assistant. Okay, so in terms of learning objectives, this course is basically, you could summarize it as having a lot to do, but a lot of flexibility in how to actually get it done. So there's sort of 5 larger scale learning objectives, which you can see here. But other than that, it's kind of up to the instructor to figure out how they want to assess the course and how they want to have students demonstrate that they've learned those learning objectives. The only really strong requirement we have administratively is the fact that in our school, we have sort of grade ranges for our intermediate courses. And so there's sort of this idea that, a well-performing class should be landing around roughly 78%, which is basically a B or a B plus on our standard rubric here. So basically what this is, the good thing about this is it gives me a lot of space to play around with different kinds of assessments and to experiment with different ways of thinking about how to evaluate students. And then finally, just to mention the institutional context here, is that this is in the context of a large public university in Canada. So you sort of plot, all the little red dots are Canadian institutions, and the blue triangles are the largest US institutions. And the one in green there, that's UBC. So we're really big, and this course, although it's normally around 50 students, it has the sort of intention that it should be scalable all the way up to well over 100 students. So whether you call it a medium or a large science class, scalability and the ability to teach lots of students with these methods is sort of implicit in what we're doing here. Okay, so why alternative assessment in the first place? Well, usually alternative assessment, when people are adopting it, it's intended to respond to some challenges in the teaching environment. And then this was really the feeling with this particular class. So causal methods are within the sort of standard economics curriculum and the econometrics curriculum, relatively complex and non-standard material. Most economics programs at larger schools will offer at least one course in this, but it's not like the thing that people see over and over again. So, and in addition, the material is historically mostly taught at a graduate level, and it's only recently been sort of trickling into the undergraduate curriculum. So basically, it's sort of advanced. There's no standard textbook for this stuff, and it can be relatively complex. It deals with complex economic and statistical issues. It also means that there's sort of a significant amount of mathematical background required to do this course. But then I have students who come into the course with a really wide range of mathematical skills. Some of the students might be coming from commerce, and they're going to be less technical, and other students will be coming from combined programs, for instance, with statistics or mathematics, and they'll have very, very, very well developed quantitative and numerical skills. Coupled with that, but by no means, it's not the same students having both of these. There's also a wide variety of computational and empirical skills. Being able to apply these skills, for instance, using a computational language like R, is also a learning objective. And so students will come in with, lots of different backgrounds when it comes to how fluid they are with different kinds of computational skills. And again, this comes with the different disciplines. And then we actually have a large number of exchange students who take this course because, as I mentioned, it's not always offered at other universities. And so they think, oh, well, if I'm here, this might be a good option for this particular course. So I'll just show you sort of over the first 3 sort of standard years of this course, when we were sort of teaching it, we would have this problem. I think this is a pretty typical problem for a lot of STEM educators, is you have like kind of one group here at the sort of lower half of the distribution where they're really, like, they're working really hard and they're trying really hard, but they're just kind of stuck at the lower end of the sort of achievement, standard for the course. And then you've got another group of students, up here who are basically, getting very, very high levels of achievement. And the reason for this is that it's basically really difficult to set an assessment that can kind of, evaluate the learning for students who are very, very strong mathematical background, that's going to be achievable for students, with weaker mathematical background at the same time. So you get this sort of bimodal distribution, which really isn't evaluating students, I would say, very fairly, but certainly not very informatively. And our primary job here was to try to come up with an evaluation or an alternative mode of assessment that would basically provide a kind of certification and information process. So to give students feedback about, what they know and how well they know it so that they can improve. And then at the end of the course to kind of certify that they have, mastered the elements of different topics in causal modeling. So this was really the motivations. We wanted to move away from your standard, weighted average assessment process to have a sort of more flexible and alternative form of grading. So the first thing I tried was contract grading. Contract grading is not new. It's actually quite an old method of alternative assessment. And basically what it does is it replaces your standard weighted average approach with an explicit contract for the grade. So basically every grade level that a student wants to earn is associated with a particular terms of contract that they have to meet, things that they have to do, levels they have to demonstrate, stuff like that. And higher grades have more stringent contracts that are required. And early in the semester, students will choose their grades ex ante, and they will commit to it by signing that contract. And there are consequences for breaking this. Now, within contract grading, there's like a million different flavors of contract grading. And I would, if you look at the literature, there's kind of three of them. The sort of most modern, most commonly used one today is sort of popularized by El-Khoury. And these are largely labor-based contracts, where the contract is really only based on just doing work and not the quality of the work. This is often used in different kinds of writing assessment. However, this is sort of a spectrum. There are hybrid models that include both labor and quality, and then there's just purely quality-based models, which is, do certain things to suit certain standards of achievement, which is sort of the older strain of this literature. So I chose contract grading because, it has a number of advantages. First of all, because students have to think about the contract that they're signing, it really encourages students to think about their own learning and what they want to get out of a course and what they want to do. So it helps develop their metacognitive skills and to reflect on what they've learned and what they want to learn from a course. It also really requires students to articulate a clear and transparent link between what they're doing, what they're going to try to do, and what they're going to get out of the course, especially when you have sort of complex learning objectives that might be linked across multiple parts of the course. And it also, as El-Khoury's sort of the labor-based model emphasizes, it can help to address implicit or explicit biases in different kinds of assessments of quality, especially in this labor-based literature. It's also particularly advantageous because it allows for flexibility in how students can sort of demonstrate or articulate their learning. So I adopted sort of something in the middle of this, in that this was sort of a hybrid implementation of this. So some of this was labor-based and some of it was quality-based. It was kind of in between here. And so basically I had, over the course of the semester, there were basically 4 exams, and I'll show you what it looked like before, and then 9 assignments that occurred over our 13-week semester. And we basically graded all the assessment was pass-fail, 60% or better. And then ultimately I had to give them a number. So we gave them a percentage based on the fraction of the total achievement they got. But most students didn't really pay attention to that. The only part of the assessment that was really traditionally graded was a final project. But I'll show you sort of like how that showed up. And then there were basically contract assessments for certain grades. Students had to sign their contract initially, and then we let them recontract sort of at the midpoint of the semester. And the consequences for breaking their contract was that they basically dropped 1 lower than whatever new contract they would have got after they violated. So to be specific, you can see what this kind of looked like here. So for instance, if you look at this little chart here, this is the sort of standard contracts that I signed with students. If you wanted an A+, you'd have to pass all the 4 exams that were given over the course of the semester, and there were sort of basic and advanced or more difficult ones. You had to pass 4 out of 5 of the assignments, the basic assignments, 3 out of 4 of the advanced assignments. Then you needed an excellent on the project, which basically corresponded to an A, and then you needed to pass the paper presentation. On the other hand, if you only wanted an A- or a B+, you didn't have to pass the advanced theory exam. You only had to pass the applied and basic theory exams. You needed 4 out of 5 of the basic assignments and 1 out of 4 of the advanced ones. And basically what you can see is this essentially let me create a sort of more chunky or you might think non-linear evaluation, in which I was able to allow students to essentially focus on more specific parts of the courses while still setting higher levels of rigor or achievement for students focusing on the looking for really top high grades like an A+, which is very, very strong. So what was the feedback, or what was sort of the outcome here? Well, first of all, you can see here when we tracked sort of student learning over the course of the semester, these are the sort of effective learning in the sort of 5 major learning categories for the course. Students generally agreed with these sort of similar levels of learning relative to when we did this for the traditionally graded courses. So we saw very similar levels of effective feedback in terms of their self-assessment of their own learning and how well they met different kinds of different learning objectives for the course. And students actually, despite the contract being, something they weren't that used to, student evaluations, when they were responded, they were actually 100% favorable when it came to things like, it was clear what I was expected to learn, and there were high standards of achievement. And 83% of them were in favor of contract grading, and they said we should repeat this in the process. And possibly the best thing is when we looked at the sort of the resulting grades here, what you can see is relative to the traditional assessment that we had a lot more students, so fewer students sort of maxing out the grade at the 100% level. And then we had students sort of hitting into that sweet spot in the 70 to 80% area. In fact, most of these were at exactly 80%, which was the cutoff for an A-. And remember, the lower grades here are students who explicitly contracted, for instance, for just a 64, because that was the grade that they felt they wanted to earn in this particular course. So what were the problems? Well, there were a few problems. The biggest problem was actually students were very worried about breaking their contract. And there were a lot of students who actually, what I would call under contracted, is that they were really they thought they could only earn an A-, but when they actually sat down and did the work, they were probably capable of learning an A+. And this possibly, has to do with their metacognitive skills, is that they literature is this idea that students might potentially under contract relative to some other benchmark that you might have for achievement. So there were a number of students who earned an A- when I felt they really could have probably earned an A+ or something like that if it had been a more traditional grading scheme here. I'll get to the questions at the end here because they're great. Okay, so with that said, I was like, okay, well, that was a fun experiment. Let's try it again. So I decided I would move to something that was talked about in some of the previous ones here, which is specifications grading. And we've talked about specifications grading before, so I'm not going to go too much into this, but basically I used the method that was popularized by Linda Nilsson in her book, Specifications Grading. And it's a close cousin of contract and mastery-based grading, where basically rather than having this sort of more labor-based or deliverables approach, you instead break it into what are called specs or specifications, which highlight different kinds of learning objectives. This was appealing to me because it matches up with the sort of backwards design philosophy for teaching and learning. And then specific levels of grade achievement are associated with particular combinations or constellations of specs. And one of the advantages is that specs are supposed to be kind of easy to grade, such as, for instance, just being labor-based. Why specifications grading? Well, again, pretty much all the benefits of contract grading are there, but without the contracting part, which is always sort of the sticking point, as I mentioned, with people over or under contracting. There's also some evidence that this might save faculty time, but every time I've tried specifications grading, that hasn't really been true. It doesn't seem to save me any time, but it doesn't take more time either, despite having more assessments. So I don't know, net, it's kind of on balance. The thing that I really appreciated was, again, the ability to link more closely to the learning objectives in the specifications and then tie those into assessments in what's hopefully a more transparent way, especially when things are complicated. So how did I implement this? Well, I sort of took the contract that I had and I said, okay, well, how's this divided up between the different learning objectives? And I basically figured out that there were 6 topic areas, each of which had 2 to 3 specifications, sort of basic topics, advanced topics, and applied topics for each of these. And then I divided them into a bunch of small assessments, which I graded on the sort of standard pass-fail basis here. And then you passed a spec if you met the cutoff line for that particular spec, which was usually about 50 to 60% of the available demonstrations of it. And then again, there was a traditionally graded final project, which was evaluated. And then again, I used the final exam and their participation grades to try to get a percentage at the end of the day. And so this was kind of what the specs looked like, is that you needed 6 out of 6 to pass 6 out of 6 of the units, again for an A+ here. 6 out of 6 of the units, you had to pass the basic specification for them. 4 out of 6, you had to pass the advanced specification for them. And then you needed 3 out of 3 for an applied one and an excellent on the project to get an A+. Whereas if you just wanted to pass the course, you only needed 4 out of 6 of the basic specifications, none of the advanced ones, and then 1 out of 3 of the applied units. And then you need to pass the paper. And this was in the syllabus, and we explained this. Now, I have less information on this one because I didn't evaluate it. It's been less time since then. But again, students were largely actually surprisingly favorable on, it was clear what I expected to learn, and they were 100% favorable that this required high standards of achievement. The biggest one where students were, relative to the contract, they were less clear on exactly how the specs tied into the grade, the final grade that they got. They mentioned things like, these are some comments from student evaluations. It's like, it's confusing at first, but then it was really helpful. You had to get your head around the grading structure. And that's sort of implicit in specs grading. It is kind of complicated. And so explaining it to students and sort of working with them is difficult. That's one of the advantages, I think, of contract writing is the metacognition and the self-reflections kind of built in. But what was good here, as you can see, again, we got sort of a similar result in terms of the overall achievement, more A+, or more A-, fewer A+ here in terms of the grading distribution. And this actually is a little bit non-representative. There should have been more in this sort of 70 to 79. So they should have been sort of blocked up here, but I made a mistake when I was doing this. And this brings me to one of the key problems you have, is that once you kind of set the specs and the correspondence between your specifications and the final conclusions, you're kind of stuck. And I didn't cover one spec, like one thing that I needed to do, because I ran out of time over the course of the semester. Then I had to reorganize things, and it became problematic to do this. It's also relatively complex, so you have to spend time explaining it, and students can be sort of confused a little bit. And one of the biggest one is that, and this is what students mentioned about the Excel spreadsheet, is it's just not well supported in most, at least in Canvas and a couple of the other LMSs I looked at, and so it's hard to communicate grades to students in relatively straightforward fashion. Okay. So what are my conclusions? I think I would consider all these experiments successes. All the students, they seem to be very engaged. There were a lot of good learning, and it helped me to sort of bridge that gap between the students who are, have had less skills going in with the students who had a lot going in. But it really does require you to have a very, very deep understanding of your course content. You have to plan really, really carefully. You have to be really, really organized, which isn't me all the time, and certainly not everyone. And you have to be very flexible and transparent when you're dealing with these grading schemes. So you have to spend the time to think about exactly how everything's going to match up and things like that. I think this would be good to do with regrading, especially with ongoing skills, but that wasn't part of the current evaluation I had. So what's next for this project? Well, in particular, you might notice that there was a lot of effective evaluation, but not a lot of external evaluation of this. What we're currently doing is we're pulling subsequent student performance for a number of alternatively graded courses, including contract and specifications grading, with the idea of trying to evaluate their performance in subsequent courses. They seem to feel like they learned the same amount, but we don't know how that translates into later success in their programs. We're also looking at the quality of the different artifacts that they were assessed on to see if there looks like there are big systematic differences. And I'm also particularly interested in trying to, for instance, the grade-regrade approach, I think would be a good benefit, as was mentioned in one of the previous talks here, sort of dovetails nicely with this. But yeah, so that's what I wanted to talk about. So that was my experience with 2 forms of alternative assessment in my course, and there's some comments here in the chat. So if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll go, if I can find my mouse, there it is. I'll read the questions here. So there's one question from Laura. I've always had a concern about layer-based assessments. Are they not unfair for students who have more outside commitments, who need to work or care for their siblings, for example, have less time available? Yeah, no, I feel like that is part of this. I think it's and that's always sort of the difference is, if you're asking people to do more things, how do you balance that, without increasing the overall workload of the course? And so one thing I tried to do was to keep the total amount of assessment similar to what was in the traditionally graded course. It, can't address the larger question about whether, it's fair to students who have external, obligations or not, but at least I would try not to increase the workload for students who are doing these things. And I think that is something we all are still grappling with as well. So I don't think I have a great answer to that, but I do think it does, by focusing more on just doing it as opposed to trying to, for instance, max out your score, it really does sort of smooth it a little bit by trying to, you only need to pass it. You don't need to get 100% to meet that particular condition, which does help to make things a little bit more fair. And what was the rationale between choosing or using their contact beforehand as opposed to, later on? The big one is to try to, there's a number of discussions of this in the literature, but the big sort of idea is that it helps students to think about their own learning and to think about what they want to learn and then to sort of plan ahead. So it encourages the self-reflection and metacognition. And a number of studies of contract grading have shown that this is sort of the a good practice for doing this, is that it helps students to focus on these things. So that's the idea. And normally you do have a sort of you can plan again if you, after the first couple of weeks. So I got them to basically after the first week of the semester, they picked their grade, and then 4 weeks in, they got to decide whether or not they wanted to change. And most students didn't change. They were pretty happy. So yeah. So I think that's all from me. I'll stop my sharing here.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
I'll hand it back over to Deb.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody that stuck with us right to the end. A special thank you to all our presenters. Their willingness to share is incredible. And I think everybody, I speak on behalf of everybody, that so many interesting and diverse ideas, really beneficial. Just a reminder, we'll be emailing everybody with the links to the videos, so you'll have access to the documents, the slideshows, the links inside the slideshows, all of that. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation, and a special thank you to Eliana. This idea is hers, these virtual institutes, and so many congratulations to Eliana on deciding to run these. I think they're terrific. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day. We'll be in touch by email. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.